Before learning its history, let us first understand what exactly is fantasy sport. Fantasy sport is a game format that gives a chance for sports fans to actively engage with the sport. They can make virtual teams with real-life players from upcoming matches, score points based on the players' on-field performance, enter a competition and compete with other sports fans. Fantasy sports actually existed way before the internet era. In the late 1950s, Wilfred Winkenbach devised fantasy golf, where players picked up from a team of pro golfers and the one with the lowest number of strokes won. He is also credited with creating fantasy football in 1962. The fantasy sports version, more familiar to us today, was created by Daniel Okrent in the 1980s with the game of baseball. He founded the Rotisserie League, where members would draft virtual teams from a list of active players and would follow their performance to score themselves each baseball season. In the 1990s, the internet ushered in a new era, with American online platforms offering hockey and baseball contests. Yahoo.com became a big destination for fantasy sports, and in 1998, platforms like CDM Fantasy Sports, Sportsline, and Prime Sports Interactive formed the first industry body for fantasy sport. The transition from fantasy season leagues to daily fantasy sports led to the next big boom across the world, from the US to Europe and elsewhere. While Europe did see the emergence of fantasy sports in the early 2000s, the big boom only came post-2016 with the popularity of daily fantasy sports as a format. In India, ESPN Star Sports launched fantasy cricket via Super Selector in 2001. I personally led a team asked to design a fantasy game that made our television viewers even more involved with non-India cricket. And Super Selector, presented by Nasruddin Shah, was a sensation in its first season. The first big Indian fantasy sport platform, Dream 11, was launched in 2008. The next decade saw fantasy sports go from an ad-driven model to freemium, from seasonal to daily formats, and lots of other changes. The legal stamp from Punjab and Haryana High Court and subsequently from the Supreme Court gave the online skill gaming the legitimacy to grow, attract investors and users. The Federation of Indian Fantasy Sports was established in 2017 to represent the industry and ensure the highest standards by creating a self-regulatory framework. Riding on the back of the rise in the use of smartphones and 4G, today India is the biggest fantasy sport market in the world with roughly 13 crore users. This is even larger than the United States, where the format originated. And with a history of engagement, record fan base and formats that have stood the test of legal challenges, the future for the Indian fantasy sports industry looks really bright.